All right, strap in, everyone. We're going deep today. We're taking a look at the Boston Strangler case. Sent in a podcast episode on this, and oh boy, does it sound like a wild ride. I mean, Boston in the early 60s, you've got these brutal murders, all these women strangled in their own homes, and the whole city is living in fear. The big question we're grappling with is, was Albert DeSalvo really the Boston Strangler? I mean, he was the one who confessed, right? But is there more to it? Is that the whole story, or is there something we're missing?
This case is really a prime example of how tricky it can be to separate fact from fiction. The media goes crazy, the public perception gets skewed, and then you throw in forensic science, which is constantly evolving. It makes it so hard to figure out what actually happened.
Okay, so let's start with what we think we know. The podcast episode you sent in, it paints a really creepy picture of Boston. Between like 1962 and 1964, the thing that really gets me is the pattern. Women alone in their homes, strangled with their own stockings. I mean, that's terrifying, right?
Absolutely. That level of detail, that's what made investigators think they were dealing with just one guy, a single perpetrator. They call it the MO, modus operandi, the killer's style, basically. And back then, no DNA testing. They had to rely on those patterns, the psychology of it all.
Right, and the podcast mentioned most of the victims were older women. I can't even imagine the fear in the city. All those women living alone must have been terrifying.
Oh, absolutely. Targeting a specific group like that. Older women living alone, it would create this sense of vulnerability. I bet everyone was double-checking their locks, maybe even afraid to be alone in their own homes.
Right, talk about unsettling. And then, just to make things even more complicated, we have Albert DeSalvo entering the scene. But here's the thing, he wasn't even arrested for murder.
It's such a crazy turn in the story. DeSalvo was already in custody for a bunch of sexual assaults, other stuff like that. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, while he's in custody, he just comes out and confesses. Says he's the Boston Strangler. And he even gives specific details about the murders. Stuff that wasn't even public knowledge.
Wait, hold on. He just, volunteered all that? I don't know. To me, that sounds like either a guilty conscience, or maybe he just wanted attention,
You've hit the nail on the head. Confessions can be tricky. Sometimes they're coerced. Sometimes they're not even reliable. People confess for all sorts of reasons. And those reasons, they don't always have anything to do with actually being guilty. Think about DeSalvo's past. He had a record, sure, but it was all minor stuff, no murders. And then suddenly, bam, he claims to be this notorious killer. Definitely raised some eyebrows.
Yeah, I can see why. So, are we supposed to believe this confession was legit? Was he really the Boston Strangler, or was he just some guy in prison looking for his 15 minutes of fame?
And here's another layer. Right from the beginning, there were problems with his confession. He gave details, vivid details, yeah. But he couldn't explain certain things, like how he even got into the victims' homes.
Okay, so we have this guy confessing to these awful crimes, but his story doesn't quite add up. Did they actually convict him based on just his word?
Not for the Boston Strangler murders, no. Even with the confession, the authorities were hesitant. They must have noticed the inconsistencies. In the end, they convicted him for his other crimes, the sexual assaults, breaking and entering. But he was never officially charged with any of the Boston Strangler killings.
So the legal system itself wasn't even totally convinced. DeSalvo ends up in prison. But the mystery of the Boston Strangler, it's still hanging over him, and over the whole city, too. What happens next? Does going to prison mean DeSalvo fades from the spotlight?
Well, in 1973, things take another strange turn. DeSalvo is murdered in prison, stabbed to death. And to make things even creepier, the case is never solved.
Are you kidding me? So, more questions than answers. It feels like every time we get close to figuring things out, something else pops up and throws us off track. A confession that might not be true, a mysterious death in prison. This is like conspiracy theory gold.
You're telling me, and there are theories out there for everything. Some people say DeSalvo was telling the truth. Others say he was set up, a patsy to protect someone else. And then there's the idea that maybe there was more than one killer.
Wait, multiple killers. Now that's where things get really interesting.
Here's where we have to think about the limitations of the time and how much forensic science has changed. Remember, this was all before DNA testing.
Right, so the investigators had to rely on what they had. Eyewitness accounts, physical evidence, good old-fashioned detective work. No fancy CSI stuff back then.
Exactly. And those methods, they're not perfect. As technology got better, they could re-examine the evidence with new tools. And that brings us to 2013. They finally got to use DNA testing. On some of the evidence they had saved from the crime scenes, I can only imagine how tense it must have been. After all these years, Would DNA finally solve the mystery?
I bet everyone was on the edge of their seats waiting for those results. Was this going to be the moment they finally confirmed DeSalvo was guilty?
And here's where the story takes another turn. The DNA they got from one of the crime scenes, it only partially matched DeSalvo's relatives. Not a perfect match.
You're kidding, they have DNA evidence, and it's still not a clear answer.
It shows just how complex this whole thing is. That partial match, it didn't completely clear DeSalvo, but it didn't prove he was guilty either. And remember, this was just from one crime scene.
It makes you wonder about the other victims. If his DNA wasn't a clear match in one case, could he have been completely innocent in others? Could there really have been multiple people responsible for all this?
Those are the exact questions that have fueled all the speculation and all the investigations for decades. If it wasn't DeSalvo in every case, then who was it? Was there a copycat killer? Was there some bigger conspiracy? These are all possibilities that need to be explored.
Okay, my mind is blown. Let's not get too lost in the conspiracy theories just yet. But tell me more about this multiple killer idea. What evidence supports that?
Well, if you look closer at the murders, there are little differences, subtle things that suggest maybe different people were involved. For example, some of the victims were sexually assaulted, but not all of them. That kind of inconsistency, it could point to different killers with different motives, different ways of operating.
So it's like trying to put together a puzzle. But some of the pieces are from completely different puzzles.
It's a lot to process, I know. And then it gets even more confusing when you consider the timing of the murders. Some of them happened in broad daylight, which totally goes against DeSalvo's usual pattern. He always seemed to operate at night.
So we have different MOs, different times a day. It's starting to feel like there wasn't just one shadow lurking around Boston. Maybe there were several.
Yeah, it's a creepy thought, right? To think that the Boston Strangler might not have been one guy, but maybe several, all with their own messed up reasons.
So let's say there were multiple killers. Where does that leave DeSalvo? Was he involved at all? Or was his confession, like, completely made up?
That's the question, isn't it? It's possible he was responsible for some of the murders, but not all of them. Or maybe, and this is something the podcast talked about, maybe his confession was just a way to get attention, like he wanted to be part of this whole horrible story.
It's hard to imagine why someone would confess to something so awful if they didn't actually do it.
Put yourself into Salva's shoes. He's already in prison, so even if confessing means more time, it might also give him a sense of power. Like, look at me. I'm the monster everyone's afraid of.
I guess I can see that. But still, the investigators must have been under so much pressure. The city's terrified. There are all these unsolved murders. And then this guy just confesses. Even if it's not a perfect confession, maybe they just wanted to believe it was true. You know, to give people some peace of mind.
It's definitely possible. When you really want to catch someone, to reassure the public that the danger is over, sometimes you can end up going down the wrong path. And DeSalvo, whether he meant to or not, he gave them someone to focus on.
This case just shows you how complicated justice can be, even when everyone's trying to do the right thing. And the idea of multiple killers, that just makes it even more confusing. How do you even start to unravel something like that?
Well, one of the keys is understanding forensic science, what it can do, but also what it can't do. The Boston Strangler case happened at an interesting time for forensics. DNA testing wasn't around yet. But blood typing, that was becoming more common.
So could blood typing have helped them figure out if there was one killer or more?
Maybe, if they found different blood types at different crime scenes. That could suggest multiple people were involved. But blood typing has its limits too. It can narrow things down. But it doesn't give you the same kind of specific identification as DNA.
So even with the tools they had back then, it was still really hard to get clear answers. And all that uncertainty, it just leaves room for speculation. This case has to be a breeding ground for conspiracy theories.
Oh, absolutely. A case like this, with so many unanswered questions and mysterious figures, it's a recipe for conspiracy theories. This case was all over the news. People whispered about connections to powerful people, organized crime, even government cover-ups. It's like something out of the X-Files.
Okay, now you have to tell me more. What are some of the craziest theories people have come up with?
Well, one that's been around for a while is that the real killer was someone important in Boston, someone with money and influence who could get away with it. Think about it. The 1960s were a time of a lot of social change. People were already suspicious of those in power.
It's like the classic, the butler did it, but on a much bigger scale. And it plays into that fear that something's being hidden from us, that there's something darker going on.
Exactly. And then there's the theory that it wasn't just one person, but a whole group, like a satanic cult or a secret society carrying out these ritualistic killings.
Okay, that one's definitely giving me chills. I can see how a case like this, with all the gruesome details and the unanswered questions, could make people come up with these dark and imaginative theories. But is there any proof for any of this?
As interesting as these theories are, there's not much evidence to back them up. Just because something happened during a certain time doesn't mean there's a conspiracy.
Right, it's about separating fact from fiction, being critical of the stories we hear. Which brings us back to the big question. After all this time, all the advancements in forensics, and all the theories, are we any closer to figuring out the Boston Strangler?
That's the frustrating thing about cold cases. Sometimes, no matter how hard you try, the answers just stay out of reach. This case reminds us that we don't always get closure. Sometimes we have to accept that the truth might stay hidden.
It's like having a puzzle with missing pieces. You try to make sense of what you have, but there are always going to be gaps. And that's where people start to imagine things.
Exactly. And that's where stories come in. Humans, we're storytellers. We need explanations, even if those explanations are based on guesses.
So where does that leave us? After all this, after diving into the Boston Strangler case, what can we take away from this whole confusing mess?
I think one of the most important things is realizing that the truth can be really hard to find. Even with confessions, forensic evidence, dedicated investigators, sometimes you just can't get the full picture.
It's like a reminder that history is always incomplete. The stories we tell ourselves about the past, they might be more about our need for an ending than about what actually happened.
That's a great point. And it shows how important it is to think critically, to question the stories we're told, to accept that sometimes. The most interesting stories are the ones that leave us with more questions.
It's so easy to get caught up in the excitement, the drama, the need for a simple answer. But cases like this, they remind us that real life is messy, it's complicated, and a lot of times there's no clear resolution.
It also reminds us that behind all the headlines, behind every podcast episode, there are real people, people whose lives were changed forever by these events, the victims, their families, entire communities living in fear. It's important to remember that human cost, even as we try to understand the mystery.
It's easy to forget about the people involved when you're focused on the evidence and the theories. But these are stories about real people, about tragedies, about the lasting impact of violence. Sometimes the best way to approach these cases is to be humble, to admit that we might never know everything.
That's an important perspective to have. And it brings up another big part of this case, the role of the media. The Boston Strangler case was everywhere. And the way the press covered it, it definitely influenced how people saw the case, even the investigators.
It's like the media story became part of what actually happened. Sometimes it's hard to tell what's real and what's just speculation.
You're right. And it makes us think about how we take in information, especially when it's about something sensational. Are we being critical enough? Are we looking at things from different angles? Are we questioning what we're being told?
Those are really important questions, especially these days, when we're constantly bombarded with information. But this case shows us that sometimes the best thing to do is to just accept the ambiguity, to accept that we might never have all the answers, and to focus on the human impact of it all, instead of getting lost in all the theories.
It's a tough balance. We need to think critically about these cases, but also with empathy and a sense of responsibility. These aren't just puzzles, you know. They involve real people, real tragedies.
Yeah, it's like we've been given this puzzle box, but the picture on the cover, it's all faded, some pieces are missing, some don't even seem to fit, and we're just left trying to figure it out.
That's a perfect way to describe this case. The Boston Strangler, it just doesn't have easy answers. It shows us that sometimes. The best we can do is try to understand how complex it all is, instead of looking for a simple solution.
It's like the case itself is telling us not to jump to conclusions, not to oversimplify things just to fit a story.
Exactly. The Boston Strangler case is all about ambiguity. It's about how our perceptions, how the media tells the story, and the limits of what we can know. It all shapes history.
We're left with this feeling, like the truth is out there somewhere. But maybe it's more complicated, more unsettling than we want to believe.
And maybe that's the biggest lesson here. The world is full of mysteries. And while it's important to search for answers, sometimes the most important thing is realizing that we don't know everything and accepting the power of the unknown.
We might never know for sure if DeSalvo was really the Boston Strangler, or if other people were involved. But we can appreciate the different layers of this case, the history, the psychology, the forensics.
And we can't forget about the people, the victims, their families, the investigators who worked on this case for years. Their stories are important too.
So, to our listener,
Yeah.
if you were investigating the Boston Strangler today, With all the technology we have now, where would you start? What would you look for? What questions would you ask?
That's a tough one. It would be a challenge for even the best detective. But that's what makes these cases so interesting. They make us think. They make us question everything, and they remind us that the search for truth is a journey, not a destination.
Well, that was quite a deep dive into one of history's biggest unsolved mysteries. We hope you enjoyed it, and that it made you want to learn more about true crime. Just remember, always be critical, and always be respectful. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep those minds open, and keep asking questions.